Indeed, this is breaking news. Vladimir Putin is preparing a new wave of mobilization in Russia to move towards a larger scale war. Several experts are reaching these conclusions based on the Kremlin's recent actions. The day before, Roskomnadzor officially announced that starting from April, Telegram, YouTube, and WhatsApp will be completely blocked in Russia. Instead, Russians are being offered a fully centralized and, importantly, fully controlled by the Federal Security Service messenger called MAKS. Any blocking of social networks always indicates an intention to cut off alternative channels of communication, sources of information, and opposition to the authorities. The Kremlin is now taking a risk because Russian soldiers on the front lines use Telegram for communication, but it also allows Russian commanders to hide certain details from higher command. But also, any social network not controlled by Putin's authorities is a place for protest groups to communicate. But that's not all. Today, the State Duma of the Russian Federation passed a truly shocking law. From now on, only the President of Russia, Vladimir Putin, has the exclusive right to determine when the Federal Security Service should completely block any communication. And this includes mobile communication, the internet, and even radio and television. Yes, now Vladimir Putin alone can completely shut down the internet and mobile communication across all of Russia at any moment. Well, I think you already understand yourself why Putin needs such levers of influence. The issue is no longer about social networks, but about effectively suppressing any protest. And what could cause a protest in Russia, you may ask? Well, let's be honest. And the Kremlin is clearly preparing a new wave of mobilization, and in this episode I will tell you exactly what signs point to this. My name is Alexei Pecci, let's discuss this topic together, but before we start, I ask you to subscribe to this channel, like this video, leave any comment under this episode, and be sure to subscribe to my Telegram channel Pecci News. The link to it is in the description of this video, where we post breaking news as it comes in. So, more and more signs indicate that Vladimir Putin is preparing for a new wave of mobilization, but he is also afraid of a protest outburst. The most popular social networks and messengers, Telegram, YouTube, and WhatsApp, will completely stop working in Russia starting April 1. As of today, the Russian authorities are restricting their operation. They already basically work poorly. And it is reported that starting April 1, Roskomnadzor will begin a total blockade of messengers across the country, just like it was with Instagram and Facebook. It is claimed that the Telegram app will not load either through mobile networks or through stationary internet systems. At the same time, Roskomnadzor has started a total blockade of any VPN services and so on. At the moment, it is no secret to anyone that Roskomnadzor has decided to block all these listed social networks. And in Roskomnadzor, of course, on the contrary, they found a reason and stated that the messengers, quote, do not comply with Russian laws, do not protect users from scammers, and do not counteract terrorism. But in reality, all these messengers simply refused to give Vladimir Putin access to users' messages. And this really upset Vladimir Putin, just so you understand. On February 16th, Telegram Moderation reported blocking more than 230,000 groups and channels in a single day. In just one day since the beginning of the year, the administration of the Telegram messenger has blocked more than 7 million groups and channels, but all this turned out to be not enough for Roskomnadzor. They stated again, listen, that's not what we asked you to do. We just asked you to give the Federal Security Service access to Russians' data. Just give the Federal Security Service agents access to Russians' messages. Why are you blocking something there? We're begging you. It's just a formal reason. And all these restrictions are happening against the backdrop of rumors about a new wave of mobilization and on the eve of the State Duma elections scheduled for September 2026. Obviously, the Kremlin wants to limit the spread of negative sentiment through messengers, but what does Putin offer Russians as an alternative? Of course, the national messenger MAKS, and here I'll briefly remind you that since September 1, 2025, the MAKS messenger must, for example, be pre-installed by default on all new smartphones and tablets sold in Russia. As a result, now Russians are left with the so-called white list of services. These are services like Gosuslugi, Yandex, Browser, vKontakte, 2 Geographic Information System, this messenger MAKS, and so on. Absolutely all of these applications are under total control of the Kremlin. And any word said in these messengers or applications, any correspondence, all of it is seen by the Federal Security Service and can be blocked. The use of other messengers and applications is now prohibited. Messenger Max is being introduced in schools, universities, businesses, and so on. As a result, the Russian Max is already being compared to the Chinese super app WeChat, which has everything you can imagine. And all of this is under the control of the Communist Party of China. And this is where we get to the most interesting part. All the restrictions on communication and the internet in Russia may be part of preparations for a new wave of mobilization and a broader conflict. At the moment, Russians are already conducting a general mobilization, divided into two lines, an indefinite draft for compulsory service and the recruitment of reservists to protect critical infrastructure. As a result, all fit Russians may be recognized as reservists. Here, the special services of the Russian Federation are pursuing several goals at once. First, there are protest groups active on social networks that avoid detection by the Federal Security Service. Blocking messengers limits access to external information and hinders the self-organization of protests. Secondly, in the military units of the Russian Federation Army, this will make it impossible to coordinate conscripts' appeals or contact from outside, for example, with Ukrainian programs for surrendering. That is, right now some Russian occupiers can find information on Telegram, contact Ukrainian special services, surrender and survive, but after the blocking they won't be able to do this. That's also something to keep in mind. In fact, Russian mobilized soldiers end up being completely cut off from the outside world and even from their own relatives. This leads to the fact that it's even easier to control this herd, and you can tell them absolutely anything you want. They'll believe anything. You could say they've taken all of Ukraine or that NATO plans to bomb everything, including Moscow. How is this mobilized guy supposed to check anything in this mess if everything is completely blocked? Plus, Putin, but I'm getting ahead of myself, can shut down any mobile connection or the internet. I'll explain what I mean a bit later. That really shocked me today. And instead of the banned platforms like the Federal Security Service, they're promoting their own alternatives. This allows them to control activity, identify protesters, and analyze behavior among both civilians and the military. It's a strategic approach. So, Russia is isolating itself, turning society against enemies all around, and then explaining that these enemies attacked first in an isolated society. It will be hard to verify this. And in this situation, everything points to war. And it's not just about blocking social networks and messengers. That's one of the factors, and now we're comparing it with other facts. Just remember, not so long ago, there were the demonstrative Zapad 2025 exercises in Belarus, where scenarios against NATO's eastern flank, the Baltic and Scandinavian countries were practiced, and at the same time, there were naval maneuvers in the Baltic and the Atlantic. The day before, NATO announced that Russia is strengthening its nuclear forces in the north and building new military bases along the border with Finland. And all this time, Russian drones have been spotted in Europe, clearly gathering intelligence. And right now, the Kremlin is actively dividing society into these military classes. Conscripts are promised service within their own borders, but don't forget, the Kremlin also legally considers the occupied territories of Ukraine as its own. That's why a conscript can be sent to Ukraine and told, well, you're not in Ukraine, you're supposedly in Russia. Reservists are only promised to guard critical infrastructure and nothing more, but the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which is occupied by the Russians, is also considered critical infrastructure of Russia. At least, that's what they think in the Kremlin. Well, as for contract soldiers, they're simply promised money. The official strength of the Russian Federation's army on paper today is 2 million. Officially, they've recruited 1.8 million, of which 700,000 are in Ukraine. As a result, there's a shortage of 400,000 soldiers. Some forces are needed to defend the rear, including 7,000 Russian defense industry facilities. Losses at the front threaten a crisis if they reach 50,000 per month plus strikes on the rear. And just recently, the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, and the Minister of Defense of Ukraine, Mikhailo Fedorov, stated that the armed forces of Ukraine are already causing up to 35,000 Russian casualties per month, including killed and wounded, but the goal is exactly 50,000 Russians per month. This is a critical threshold when Russia can't even replenish its losses in time, not to mention forming a reserve reserve. And at the moment, in order to avoid mass protests in Russia, the mobilization is being split into parts. There are conscripts, there are reservists, there are contracts, and it all looks like a voluntary system, but in reality it's not. Just pay attention to what's really happening, even though it's all wrapped up in a nice package. And if the new wave of mobilization in Russia still seems far-fetched to you, I'll give you one last argument. Today, the State Duma of the Russian Federation passed a law giving the Federal Security Service the right to block any communication in Russia based solely on an act by President Vladimir Putin. The document was supported immediately in the second and third readings without any discussion. The whole process took only 3 minutes. Now let me explain what this means. From now on, Vladimir Putin has received the exclusive right to determine cases when the Federal Security Service of the Russian Federation can completely shut down any type of communication across the entire country. In fact, Vladimir Putin now has the sole right to shut down the internet and mobile communications across the entire country at any moment. Usually, this is done when there is a fear of a sudden surge in protests. This mechanism was well practiced in Iran when the Ayatollah's regime sent the entire country into a so-called digital blackout. And interestingly, the Kremlin cited, quote, the protection of citizens and the state from emerging security threats as the reason for blocking communications in Russia. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like if you found this episode useful and interesting. You can support our YouTube channel financially with any donation or a paid sponsorship subscription. For example, sponsorship on YouTube, Patreon, Buy Me Coffee, PayPal, or crypto wallets. All the details are in the description of this video. I would appreciate any support from you. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.